I'm Welton Gaddy, host of State of Belief Radio, with our continuing coverage of the 2016 Republican National Convention in Cleveland, Ohio. It's Thursday, July 21st, and I'm joined by Rabbi Jack Moline, president of Interfaith Alliance. Jack, it's over. What stood out for you on this final session of the convention?
Two things, Welton. The first thing that stood out for me was the music. I have to tell you, stunned, in spite of the fact that three of my favorite songs from the 60s, Rod Stewart's Stay With Me, All Right Now, and You Can't Always Get What You Want, were played as part of Mr. Trump's presentation. I can't think of three more inappropriate pieces of music to play for presidential candidate. Two of them deal with a one-night stand, and the other one deals with the Rolling Stones continual theme of they can't get no satisfaction. So that stood out for me. But the other thing that stood out for me is that Mr. Trump spoke for a very long time and said very little. It was a repetition of the themes that we'd heard all week. He did it very well, I have to say. But I had really hoped, as I have been hoping through this entire campaign, to hear him talk about some specific proposals for policy. And as far as I could tell, he only had two. One was to dismantle our trade system, about which Interfaith Alliance has nothing to say. And the other is to repeal the Johnson rule, which prevents pastors, rabbis, imams from endorsing candidates from the pulpit. And to that, I will object loudly and strongly.
Well, let me tell you, you're going to have a real fight on your hand. We went through this while I was in that chair, and it was a pretty difficult battle then, and it's going to be even more so now. I think you ought to say just a word about what it's all about, and then we'll pick that up again.
So most people are under the misconception that pastors and other religious officials can't participate in public campaigning. That's absolutely not true. What the IRS regulations, not the law, but the IRS regulations demand is that when they are in the pulpit and when they're representing their house of worship, they stay free of partisan advocacy. And that is to protect both the political system from the kind of abuses we heard from Pastor Mark Burns on the first night of the convention, and I think more importantly, it is to protect houses of worship from the intrusion of government and political figures. You actually heard Mr. Trump illustrate my point tonight when he thanked the evangelicals for their support, even though he didn't deserve it, as he said. And what this means, if that rule is repealed, is that pastors will feel free to pander to, cater to the candidate of their choice, and their parishioners will suffer if that candidate loses, and others will suffer if that candidate wins. I can't think of anything worse for the faith community in the United States.
Very true. Jack, I know you can't erase the past, but consider for a minute a potential voter hearing Donald Trump's speech tonight as their first time really considering him seriously. Would his speech have worked for that person?
I think it would depend on what attitude the voter came to hear the speech with. If this was someone who was insecure and someone who was afraid of change and of the differences in society around him, I think that voter might very well have heard a savior in Donald Trump. If this were someone who understood that we live in a different world than we did in 1955 or in 1962, then I think, like me, they would be terrified by some of what they heard. Yeah. That law and order is going to be restored to this country, and you better believe it because I say so. That's a shot across the bow for civil disobedience, which is a cherished heritage in this country.
Looking back over the whole week, what comes to mind when I ask, what did you appreciate? And what comes to mind when I ask, what were your most disappointing moments?
I actually appreciated Ivanka Trump. I thought her talk tonight was magnificent It was a loving portrait of her father. It was, I think, a better articulation of his values and his priorities than he was able to muster for himself. She's obviously a young woman with a good deal of conscience, and she was quite clear that she didn't consider herself a Democrat or a Republican. She voted for the person she considered to be the best candidate, and in her opinion, that was her father. If I could commend an approach to the American people, it would be exactly that approach. So I was impressed by her.
Yeah.
What was I disturbed by most? Well, when we're taping this at almost midnight, and if you and I are going to get any sleep tonight, I can't answer that question.
Okay, well, look, in just a few days, we're going to meet up with each other in Philadelphia and be there for the beginning of the Democratic convention, and we're going to have time to talk there. But let me just ask you one question about that. What will you be listening for from the Democrats?
Well, selfishly, I'm going to be listening for a little more emphasis on First Amendment guarantees, and particularly true religious freedom guarantees, than I've been hearing from the Democrats of late. I'm not willing to cede to the Republicans, or more appropriately, I think, to the religious right, a misinterpretation of what constitutes religious freedom in this country. And I'm going to be looking for individuals who will stand up for freedom of conscience and for the guarantees of the Constitution, which are not mutually exclusive.
Rabbi Jack Moline is president of Interfaith Alliance. Jack, thanks for being with us. I'll see you in Philadelphia in just a couple of days at the Democratic National Convention. I'm Welton Gaddy for State of Belief Radio.